Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. And by virtue of that, I know that you all have pulled off something in becoming the state representatives from Wisconsin, and have to be real careful here, but congratulations. So I am a former chair of the State Bar's Law-Related Education Committee and retired from the juvenile court bench here in Milwaukee County.
Good afternoon, Wisconsin. My name is Troy Delap, and I am an alum of the program. I was a student in 1996, and going to nationals was an exciting experience. So I'm really, really happy that everyone pulled up their bootstraps and got this virtual experience going. Other than that, I am a lobbyist. I have a small lobbying firm in the great state of Nevada. And also I'm the executive director of the Nevada Center for Civic Engagement, which is the home for We the People programs, this one, Project Citizen, and all other good stuff. So I'm real excited to see what you got for today.
Greetings, Wauwatosa East, not to be confused with Wauwatosa West. It is a thrill to be here, and my name is Lynn Uzel, and I teach American politics at the University of Virginia.
Will you introduce yourselves and your teacher? And Tyler, you disappeared for a while there. We got to see part of you, so be careful on that. Would you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Yes. Good afternoon, judges. We are the Unit 2 representatives from Wauwatosa East in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. Our coaches are Mr. Daniel McHugh and Mr. Tyler Marson. My name is Audrey Andera.
My name is Jack Stewart.
My name is Sophie Hardman.
And my name is Caroline Minix.
As you know, it is question 1 out of Unit 2. The states sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention to join with other states in devising and discussing all such alternatives and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. To what extent, if any, did the delegates follow their instructions? What experiences of state governments under their new constitutions after independence might have influenced the creation of the Constitution? Do the decisions of the United States Supreme Court function as a continuing constitutional convention? Why or why not? Again.
The instructions for the Philadelphia Convention were clear. Alter the Articles of Confederation to rectify the nation. However, as the first order of business, the delegations voted 6-1 to scrap the Articles entirely and propose a new national government. The framers understood that the turmoil of the Confederation period was so dire that drastic change was needed in order to render the federal government, quote, adequate to the exigencies of the Union, end quote.
When the Annapolis Convention called for delegates to be sent to Philadelphia, the request included the expectation to promote the general welfare of the nation. However, many delegates were required to vote in favor of the interests of their state, no matter what happened. For example, the Pennsylvania delegates were told to avoid any treaty of commerce or alliance with any foreign powers, and the Delaware delegates were told not to allow equal representation. Therefore, instead of driving for change unilaterally, alliances were formed between delegates with common interests, such as large and small states or free and slave states.
Despite the difference from the convention's original goals, the framers' actions were necessary to preserve the Union. The variety of viewpoints required compromises to benefit the new nation. The debate on representation was an ongoing discussion. Larger states wanted representation according to population, while smaller states wanted equal representation, regardless of population. The Connecticut Compromise served as a middle ground, and has now become the backbone of our bicameral legislature. They ensured a strong central government that prevented tyranny by the states and promoted a greater sense of nationalism.
The framers' use of the Virginia Plan as a basis for the convention was a far cry from the goals put on them by Annapolis, but created a foundation grounded on the ideas of state constitutions. Collectively, the states first established many important building blocks, such as governments being reliant on popular sovereignty and providing a system of checks and balances between the three branches. They also tested smaller ideas like money bills originating in the lower house of the legislature and the plausibility of religious tests. The delegates also drew from their state's own experiences as the basis for the proposed constitution. For example, Shays' Rebellion prompted the Massachusetts delegation to advocate for a federal government that could effectively collect taxes and put down internal rebellions. Similarly, the flaws of the Pennsylvania state constitution were highlighted during the Fort Wilson riots. The class warfare and tyranny by elite politicians showed the dangers of mob rule and caused the founders to establish more restrictive voting rights than those in the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776.
In the 232 years since the Philadelphia Convention, the establishment of judicial review in Marbury v. Madison was necessary to allow the Supreme Court to function as a modern-day constitutional convention and drastically change its interpretation. Cases like Brown v. Board of Education, Loving v. Virginia, Obergefell v. Hodges, and Roe v. Wade all played critical roles in expanding the 14th Amendment. It even has the potential to pressure future change in the legislature, as in the case Chisholm v. Georgia, where the Supreme Court's ruling was later reflected in the 11th Amendment. Judicial review furthers discussion and allows for expansion upon the constitutional principles and ideals in order to keep the Constitution relevant and applicable to everyone.
Although the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention entered prioritizing their own state's interest, their work at the convention and its continuing adaptation by the Supreme Court has guaranteed the United States the longest surviving written constitution in the world. This concludes our statement, and we are now ready for your questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm gathering from my hearing of what you had to say that you value the judicial review as interpreting the Constitution, but don't see it as a continuing constitutional convention. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes, I think we see it more as interpreting the Constitution to be applicable in the modern era as opposed to changing it entirely.
And that includes your reference to the 14th, I believe you made reference to the 14th and 11th Amendments, so as interpreting as opposed to putting out new ideas, is that?
Yes, I think that a lot of the things that the 14th Amendment, when the 14th Amendment was written, a lot of the things that were protected under that are, well, there are things that have been realized throughout the years that now we realize that need to be protected under the 14th Amendment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so since we're talking about the 14th Amendment came later than the Constitutional Convention. So if the 14th Amendment was so pivotal to provide the Supreme Court with this power of being an enduring convention, that doesn't seem to make, who created the 14th Amendment?
I think at the Constitutional Convention, obviously we can see that the Federalists got the upper hand on many of the compromises, and so I think that's mainly why such rights, such as those listed in the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protections Clause, weren't really established then. But we, as the nation progressed, we saw a need to greater emphasize that all men are created equal and that we really needed the 14th Amendment.
I agree. I would say that judicial review, it was actually talked about at the convention. Madison mentions it in Federalist 39. But many of the founders were fearful of judicial review because during the Confederation period, there was no judicial branch and they weren't sure what was going to happen if that was added.
Well, let me ask you a different sort of question. So you had mentioned that the scrapping of the Articles of Confederation was justified because such drastic changes were needed. But what I want to know is who were the delegates representing? Because you have appealed to the instructions of the Annapolis Convention, the instructions of Congress, and the instructions that were coming from the states themselves. So the delegates to the Federal Convention, who were they representing?
I think we can see a lot of them were mainly representing what their states wanted and what their states felt needed to be in this Constitution, rather than, I think, entirely what the people always wanted. I would argue that they were actually sorry, I would argue that they were actually representing their union and wanting what was best for the nation itself. Many of the state's experiences were actually very similar, like Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts and Fry's Rebellion in Pennsylvania. They were both similar problems in the fact that Congress wasn't able to tax. So I think, yes, their own state experiences had something to do with their decisions, but it was really to benefit the nation since their problems were so similar.
Since they all gathered under the Articles of Confederation, and Rhode Island didn't bother to go, and didn't go because they thought people weren't going to follow the rules. Didn't everything that followed essentially break the rules so that this was essentially illegitimate?
Yeah, we can see at the Constitutional Convention, founders like William Patterson argued that since the Articles of Confederation were created unanimously, we needed unanimous consent in order to scrap them. And so while as I do see value in unanimous consent, we can see that they believed that the livelihood of the nation as a whole was far more important than the unanimous consent, and really took rule of the majority into consideration when proposing the new constitution.
Okay, thanks.
What's your feeling about unanimous consent? Is that, with something as big as the structure of the core government, do you think that we need unanimous consent, or is that a slippery slope into tyranny of the majority?
I think that it's difficult in this instance. Obviously, under the Articles of Confederation, they needed all of the states to agree. And I think that because all of the states at the time of the Constitutional Convention had differing opinions, the Constitution wasn't going to be perfect for everyone. But I think that them having only 9 states having to agree, it allowed those 9 states to agree, but then the states that didn't necessarily ratify before that, I think that they realized that it was just beneficial for the whole nation to survive in the new world, for all of them to agree to this new constitution that they were writing.
I would disagree and say that unanimous consent is sometimes needed. When we look at the Philadelphia Convention, one thing that they didn't come to a conclusion on is slavery. They didn't make a decision one way or another. And ultimately, this led to the Civil War. The 3/5 compromise wasn't necessarily what actually represented the slaves. It was mainly in their slave owners' interests. So I think at that time, they should have came to a decision unanimously.
Okay, thank you. So, a couple of things. And, okay, again, being careful, you did me proud would be the best way for me to say that. I'm very much happy to, when we get off the air, to tell people, yeah, those are my people. So good for you. I really, and the point that we were ending on, this whole unanimous agreement, you know, bless your heart if you believe that everybody's ever going to say the same thing. That won't ever happen. We'll never be able to do that. And clearly, in order to have a national government, we're going to have to change that. You had far too much difference. You had, you know, the industrial people up here, you had slave owners, you had agricultural, it wasn't going to happen. And I guess there's a point that you say, just because we made a mistake in the beginning doesn't mean we have to stick with it. I appreciated your discussing the fact there was a 6-1 vote to scrap this. The specifics of it. You did a good job of identifying where the state's contributions were in constitutions. The citations of the judicial review cases, good. I need to be quiet because we got a late start. Good job.
Yep.
I like that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to echo the comments of my colleague. I think you guys did a great job. It's an interesting, you covered in great detail, I think, a nice balanced response to this question, talking about the historical context with some Annapolis Convention and the turmoil. And I think what I would have appreciated was some better clarity in stitching together the connections between the turmoil and the need to defect, basically. This is interesting, this pressure for and unanimousness is not practical. But and you can see you described when the delegates went to the convention, they instantly started counting and dividing and doing these things. So I think that's an important detail that you brought up. But I appreciated the response to the questions and overall your presentation. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to reiterate and reinforce what my colleagues have said. I thought that you did a really good job of hitting all the major points in the question, and also I liked that you had some variety in your responses. That when you responded, you would actually play off of each other and not always agree on the same perspective. And I thought in general you guys worked well as a team. So once again, congratulations, and I couldn't be more pleased that you were willing to try this brave new world of Zoom competition. So here's to you.